Composing music for horror movies or games can be an intimidating prospect for some composers. Most of the time, you can't rely on traditionally tonal, classical-esque techniques to make the listener afraid, and usually composers see atonality and modern classical techniques as the most effective way of frightening the audience. In order to understand how professionals in the industry tackle this predicament, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the music of one of my favorite game franchises, Resident Evil. I think this series is great at making the threat feel menacing, and a huge part of that is the music, which makes you hesitate to go into the next room or panic enough to make stupid mistakes in fighting an enemy. In preparation for this video, I've spent many days listening to almost every piece of music in the Resident Evil franchise and analyzing what makes it effective as a horror ambience. So let's go ahead and dive right into the key takeaways. The music of Resident Evil tends to operate on two axes that I'm going to be calling dread and tension. Dread music is typically used when the player character is not in direct immediate danger, reserved for area themes and general exploration. You can think of dread music as unnerving, creepy, that feeling that makes you hesitate to go through the next door. Tension music, on the other hand, is used mostly for combat encounters, boss fights, and any other situations in which the game wants your heart to be racing. This music is not necessarily scary in the same way as dread music, but gets adrenaline pumping and creates an unrelentingly intense atmosphere. Now, dread and tension are not mutually exclusive parameters, and the composers behind the music of Resident Evil do in fact blend them together as they see fit to do. Let's take a closer look at how they do it. First, we'll cover how Resident Evil creates dread from its music. This might be obvious to some of you, but the easiest way to creep out the listener is with dissonance, and Resident Evil makes sure to fill their music with tons of it. However, what Resident Evil composers really love to do for their out-of-combat themes is to create intense dissonances against a pedal point. If you're unfamiliar with the benefits of pedal points, they allow for completely unrelated and horizontally dissonant chords to be played one after the other without losing the tonal center. By using a pedal point, the piece never feels too resolved while still allowing for plenty of dissonance that doesn't feel plain incorrect. Here are the first few seconds of The City Without Hope from Resident Evil 3. While you listen, notice how dissonance increases or decreases with the addition of new notes, and the effect that has on the piece's overall tone and sense of dread. This piece and many Resident Evil tracks don't use chords as their foundation in the way that you might for a typical song. Instead, the composers for this track were thinking in intervals. Notice how in the beginning, as voices are introduced one by one, uneasiness rises as sharper dissonances are created. After this first hit catches the listener's attention, a C natural pedal point is used to establish a tonal center. The first few notes to creep into the upper register are relatively open, neutral sounds like fifths, fourths, octaves, until the D natural creates a major second against the bass note. Then, in the third measure, the dissonance is ramped up with a D flat, E flat, and B natural. Introduced one by one, these notes together don't sound as sharply dissonant as they probably should, but then of course in the fourth measure, all notes are played at once rather than being introduced gradually, creating that terrifyingly ugly sound. All the while, the pedal point keeps us grounded in a C minor-ish sound, despite all the chromaticism going on in the upper staff. Using whatever note you want for the sake of dissonance is certainly going to disorient and confuse your listener, which is not always what you want from horror music. However, as we all know, dissonance is uncomfortable, and mounting dissonance that grows over time is even more uncomfortable because in our subconscious, we as the listener get the impression it's only going to get worse. Thus, the feeling of dread is created. When that is combined with a pedal point, you get a piece that fills the listener with dread, but doesn't distract them with hard-to-decipher tonality. But pedal points don't have to be held for too long if it's not necessary, which brings me to another feature of the pedal point that can be used to the composer's advantage. Pedal points are predictable and create an expectation for the measures that follow. Therefore, changing the pedal point can create a dramatic shift in the tone of the music, just as much as a sudden key change in more conventionally written music. One of my favorite examples of this is in the Marshalling Yard second half from Resident Evil 2. This piece sits on top of a G bass note for nearly the entire runtime, laying textural elements and brief phrases over top throughout to create open, somewhat alien-sounding dissonances, contributing to an atmosphere that's not exactly spine-chilling, but certainly doesn't have the comforting aura of, say, a safe room. After creepy synthesized vocals and guitars have had their opportunity to dance over the steady pedal point, this guitar line comes in. Notice how only that A natural belongs to the key of G minor. This line completely confuses the listener's sense of tonality before being hit in the face with a change in pedal point from G to E, signposting a completely new section. Paired with the much spookier sounding instruments used for this section and the greater, more clashing dissonances, this section is clearly meant to evoke a much darker tone than the previous one that started out the piece. Not to mention, the pedal point does not stay on A natural for very long, instead cycling to other tonalities in this brief section that only lasts about 30 seconds. Because of this, the section does not have the security and stability that usually comes with the pedal point, and instead feels like the listener is falling deeper and deeper into a dark abyss, or finding themselves caught up in a darker conspiracy than they initially imagined. There's one more detail about this change in pedal point which just so happens to make for a great segue. The bass changes from that steady G minor-like tonality when it drops to E natural, not E flat, going down by a chromatic mediant relationship, a tool that classical musicians will strongly associate with both the Romantic era of classical music as well as modern cinematic classical music. To dive further into this relationship, it's worth pointing out that one technique Resident Evil composers love to use is brief passages that are relatively straightforward, scored usually for a typical orchestral setup, embedding in the music a kind of classical-esque vibe that we know and love from horror media. The connection between classical music and horror has been made time and time again, particularly to evoke an evil that is not of this world, in the zombies and vampires way as opposed to the sci-fi and aliens way. In these classical-esque passages that Resident Evil uses, the chromatic mediant relationship is king. Check out this passage from the main theme of Resident Evil Outbreak. The vamp between G minor and B flat minor is what drives this piece and gives it its characteristic Victorian feel. The piece isn't the spookiest thing in the world, but I think few would deny the dread is still there. As the piece continues to evolve, it moves on to the same pattern transposed to D minor, once again a chromatic mediant from B flat minor. Now let's check out the overture from Darkside Chronicles to see how else this relationship can be used. This piece uses the exact same technique of vamping between the minor 1 and the minor 3, but instead of continuing on and piling on more chromatic mediants, this piece takes the opportunity to jump into a much more dissonant and dominant sounding chord at the end of the piece. By lowering your guard with the vamp, the composer is able to create much more drama and dread through an unexpected chord that almost jump scares you. This kind of subversion of expectations is one of the primary ways that Resident Evil composers are able to frighten the player even when nothing particularly scary is in frame. And, of course, once a precedent is set for jump scares in the music, the dread is increased across the board. But these jump scares create tension just as much as their absence creates dread. Going forward, I'm going to call these jump scares hits, and you can think of them as cashing in on any building dread that a piece of horror music might cultivate. Hits are the abrupt sforzandos that interrupt the relatively quiet atmosphere, and if the composers played their cards perfectly up to that point, they should hopefully startle the player as much as any piece of music can. As our example of hits, let's take a look at the City of Ruin from Resident Evil 3. This piece is a fairly typical example of a moody, atmospheric area theme whose dissonance waxes and wanes throughout. As we know from previous examples, percussion rarely plays a part in these kinds of tracks, but in the City of Ruin, a piercing hammer-on-anvil sound effect rings through every once in a while to put an exclamation mark on the slow-moving strings that proceed. Notice here how the hits almost interrupt the sequence, cutting back to the creepy part full of dread that follows. You might also notice that the hit will be repeated softer and without the anvil, creating this echo-like quality. Anytime an echo is used in a game like this, it reminds the player that they're in a space that is bigger than what is actively being seen on screen, which keeps the player's mind on the danger to come. In general, these hits take the piece from unnerving to threatening, which is why if you're a composer, you have to consider carefully where you put hits, and if you even include them at all. Threatening is not always the vibe you want from your piece. Including hits such as these can completely change the character of your piece in the ways it consciously affects the listener. The next way of creating tension in horror music is to never allow empty space. In our creepy, dread-based music, silence can be very effective in creating a sense of fearful anticipation for what's going to come next. In a battle theme or other intense danger-filled section, however, you don't want the player to have a chance to breathe. Check out what this piece from Code Veronica does to facilitate that dangerous feeling. This section of the game is an action-packed race to rescue Steve after hearing him call out for help. Therefore, the composer wanted to rush you as much as it is possible to do through the music. The main way this is achieved is through the frantic bass ostinato and the constant rhythm being laid down by the percussion. This creates a stream of eighth notes that distinguish this piece significantly from its more slow-paced counterparts. By continuing to lay down note after note with no space to breathe, the player's adrenaline goes up and an air of danger is immediately created. Perhaps more effective than the rhythm here is the way the bass jumps around, not staying on the tonic note for too long at all. You'll see this all over the place in video game boss music when the composer wants to create a sense of urgency and chaos. The last thing to note about this piece, I want to call your attention back to the use of hits in the fourth measure to keep the piece from becoming too stagnant, keeping the listener on their toes. To emphasize these hits, the accented snare is underlined by cymbals, instantly making the hits stand out more to catch the listener's attention. It ultimately creates a fast-paced, explosive track that rushes the player forward without making it too obvious. Speaking of percussion, let's talk about the way that Resident Evil uses it to create tension. I've already mentioned how the softer dread themes avoid percussion except for in the cases of hits, but in our more intense tension tracks, percussion is the driving force that keeps adrenaline pumping. Marching snares seem to be the Resident Evil go-to for the steady eighth note rhythm we just talked about, but bass drums, gongs, cymbals, and other more exotic percussion instruments can also take part. A common move is to replace the driving rhythm of a snare drum for the same thing on a taiko. Notice how this creates a more modern cinematic feel like in an action movie. Bass drums can also be used infrequently, either to accent hits or establish the beginning of some kind of melodic form. Alternatively, a constant bass drum can create this heavy sound that evokes a lumbering monster, or maybe the pounding of the player's heart in their ears. And then, of course, cymbals draw the listener's attention to points of interest, such as hits, as we just saw in the Hot Rescue track from Code Veronica. One last interesting thing that Resident Evil likes to do with the percussion is substitute orchestral percussion for recorded sound effects, and in a lot of cases, these can be more effective at creating hits or clarifying the tempo than any real instruments can. In this final section of the video, instead of dread or tension, I'd like to talk about some other bonus takeaways that don't really fit in the other section of the video. These are the elements that are maybe not as universal to every Resident Evil soundtrack and are instead scattered throughout the franchise's musical history to create a sound that I find especially effective. The first one is aleatoric techniques. Of course, Resident Evil music is usually not played by a real orchestra, but it's no surprise to anyone that the effects created by allowing musicians to play whatever they want have long been linked to the world of horror music, and Resident Evil is no exception, simulating aleatoric passages when a chaotic, panicked feel is needed. Something you may have already noticed in previous example tracks is the avoidance of conventional melodies over the accompaniment. Instead, Resident Evil composers usually opt for foreground elements that fade in and out and don't make much sense in relation to one another. This is especially handy in high-tension themes when the percussion rhythm or bass ostinato is supposed to be the focal point of the piece. One cliche that is very prominent in especially the early soundtracks is the low piano note that sounds out like a church bell and echoes to fill the silence. Using a pedaled piano note that rings out for forever is a super effective way to make a piece practically silent while filling empty space as little as possible. It makes for this great haunting atmosphere that's hard to get any other way. And of course, it's a super easy way to lay down a pedal point without droning on and on with a sustained cello or whatever. Lastly is what I would call the third most important takeaway other than our discussions on dread and tension, and that is sound effects. Use them. Video game music is a form of electronic music, and sometimes the scariest noise possible can't be created on a traditional orchestral instrument. And then, of course, most of the time what you hear for a significant chunk of your playthrough is just the feeling of fear is created by the threat of danger yet unseen, so don't be afraid to utilize these kind of ambient sound effects to your advantage to spook the player with something that's not actually there in engine. So yeah, that covers all the most relevant and prominent features of Resident Evil horror music, and this is not even covering other non-horror music in the game, such as save room themes, which are a whole other category of their own. If there's a lot of demand for a video on save room themes, I'll definitely give that a try. Just, let me know in the comments. Also, feel free to comment any other common features of Resident Evil music that you've noticed in the games, but I may have omitted in this video. But that's all I have to share for now. Now it's up to you to use the things we talked about in your own music, making the techniques learned here today into your own thing. Don't be afraid to experiment, use crazy unique instruments, or implement other modern classical techniques other than aleatoricism. Or try to break one of the rules we talked about today while still keeping it creepy. Whatever you choose to do is up to you, and if this video should inspire you to make something, I hope you'll leave your track in the comments so the rest of us can hear it. If this video was helpful to you, I'd also appreciate if you liked the video or subscribed. And I'll hopefully see you again in the next video. Until next time.